Okay, let's talk about OKRs and strategy. As a product coach, I have the privilege of working with many different companies, many founders, product leaders all around the world, and I see OKRs all the time, and frankly, most of them aren't very good. Most of them kind of suck. And what I want to do today in this video is take you through why I believe that's the case. There are many reasons for it, but there is a core reason that I see, or a core mistake that I see happen over and over again. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about some of the things you can do around to solve that. And if you are interested in implementing OKRs and some of the common anti-patterns that I see around that, I did a video on that recently, which you can find. It'll pop up there, link in the description as well. So let's talk about why I think probably the number one reason why I think OKRs aren't very good, why companies struggle with them. And there's been some of my favorite people around strategy have talked about this recently. Roger L. Martin did a blog post about OKRs masquerading as strategy and the challenges around that. I'll throw a link around that as well if you're interested in reading it. It is a good read. But, even if you go back to Richard Rummel said it in his book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. He said one of the top 4 reasons why bad strategy is so prevalent inside organizations is because companies mistake goal setting for strategy. And I think the proliferation of OKRs has kind of been like fuel to the fire on this. Being popularized by Google, originated out of Intel, but OKRs became this new fad, this new framework that we wanted to adopt inside companies. And, plenty of consultancies and stuff can spin a really good story about why they help, places like Google succeed and why we should do the same thing. And then companies go and implement it and they neglect all the work that is needed in order to set that OKR in the first place. And they fall into the trap that Richard Rummel was describing, which is mistaking OKRs for strategy, which is really the underlying tone of Roger L. Martin's blog post. Now, to illustrate why these two things are different, here's what I see all the time, and here is the common problem. So, what I see all the time inside companies is they set an OKR and then they go and they define the work. Okay, what is all the work that we need to do in order to achieve that OKR? Now, a common problem that companies get themselves into in this position is the OKR on its own doesn't answer some key questions, right? So one of the questions would be like, why did we set this OKR? Why did we choose this OKR? Out of all of the objectives that we could be chasing right now, why did we pick this one over the other ones? It doesn't explain as well, what's that longer term horizon? So a common pattern that I see inside companies is we set OKRs on a quarterly cycle, which means that we just end up living our life one quarter at a time. I like to refer to this as the death by quarters. I've literally talked with product managers and teams that tell me like, I can't set a long-term roadmap because I don't know what we're going to be doing next quarter because I'm waiting for the upper echelons of the company to set an OKR and to tell me, and I have no visibility over the next OKRs that are going to be set. But we end up in this short-term game where we're kind of living our life one quarter at a time. Now, the overarching problem is kind of this. We set the OKR, then there's the work, but most companies, and I hope you do, most companies have a long-term vision, right? So there's some type of long-term vision at the top. Now, the big problem here is that there is a very large gap between a multi-year vision, like a 3 to 4, 5, 10, 15, 20-year vision, depending on what level of fidelity your vision's at, and that quarterly or even yearly OKR that you just set. There is a very big gulf between that. So what the OKR is not answering for us is it's not answering fundamental questions like, why do we pick this OKR? What data led us to choosing this OKR over other OKRs? How is this OKR a stepping stone? So if we were to achieve this OKR, what's next? What's after that? What's after that? How does this all fit together? I've got an OKR here. This team has an OKR over there. Another team has an OKR over there. How does this all fit together? This is made worse as well in some companies where we have these constructs where, and I'll just sketch it really quickly. We have these constructs where, let's say there's a team here, product team, and there's multiple OKRs coming from different areas of the business that are all leading to them. They're kind of stuck there, confused. Like, how do these things fit together and how do I prioritize my work? And creates all kinds of challenges around that. The reason why these are all challenges is because there is nothing binding all these OKRs together. There's a whole bunch of context that is missing around that OKR. The context that is missing is strategy. So this comes back to Richard Rummel and his point about mistaking OKRs for strategy. OKRs are not your strategy. They are not a substitute for strategy. Whilst they may sit inside the strategic layer or the layer around strategy, and I'll talk about that in a second, they are two fundamentally different things. So let's talk about that. Let's explain the difference between that. In order to do that, I'm going to use the example of Tesla. I've used this before. If you've watched some of my other videos around strategy, particularly this one around the difference between strategy and roadmaps, I use Tesla as an example. A few reasons for that. One of the reasons is the fact that Tesla is a company that most of you will know about. It doesn't require a lot of explanation. You will understand what Tesla is, what they do, and you have the context there. I don't need to explain the company. As well as Elon has been very generous in a sense that he's been blogging about Tesla's strategy for many years. So we have a little bit of insight into what their strategy is. So we don't need to guess too much. So in the video and in previous videos, when I've used this as an example, Tesla had a long-term vision, and Elon Musk shared that vision in a 2013 blog post, and he talked about how the vision today in 2013 remained the same as what it was a decade ago, and that was to accelerate the advent of sustainable transport by bringing compelling mass-market electric vehicles to market. So this is a very important piece of context. Remember that I said before, there's a very big gap between a long-term vision and a near-term OKR. So if Tesla's vision was always mass-market vehicles, why on earth did they build a Roadster first, right? So if all we need is a long-term vision and OKRs, which some people would tell you that is all you need, then if the only context I had was the long-term vision, why would I build a Roadster? I probably wouldn't. I'd probably start with the Model Y and the Model 3 and some type of mass market car that I have that Tesla's producing today. But Tesla didn't start there. And the reason why they didn't start there was because they had a strategy. So let's go through some of that context that led to those choices. So one of the important pieces of context was the fact that they knew that the first version or the first car that Tesla was going to produce was going to be expensive no matter what. It's new technology. They haven't perfected it. There's a whole bunch of R&D that needs to happen. It was going to be expensive. The other reason why they knew it was going to be expensive is because new technology is often viewed under increased scrutiny, as it should, because it's new and there's risk involved. And so we want to look at it under a new lens. So if we know it's going to be expensive and we know that we've got a long road ahead of us of investing into R&D, high costs around R&D to be able to learn more, perfect the technology so we can lower the cost, so we can eventually build those more affordable cars, then why not actually build a high-end car? Because the difference between building the Roadster versus building the Model 3 in terms of cost to Tesla is probably not going to be too different, not at that point in time, because of just how expensive the car was going to be. So if the cost to the business was not going to be too different, and yes, one fits, and this is the challenge, right? So the Model 3 fits better with the vision. So it would be easy to rationalize, well, let's do that. But this is where you need to pause, and this is where strategy comes in. So the problem with producing the Model 3 is that you can't charge a premium for it. You can't, it's not an expensive sports car, but a Roadster is, which means that they can target a high end of the market who are willing to pay a premium. So we can hopefully make some profit, and we can use that profit to then fund R&D. And that is exactly what Elon shares in his blog post. He basically says that every person who buys a Roadster is essentially funding R&D for the next car. Now, this is a hard part about strategy, is that there's no right or wrong here, really. If you look at like a lot of the brands coming out of Asia and China right now, they've done a different strategy. They have gotten a lot of investment, and they have started at the low end, and they've just basically running a loss, and then hopefully will make the money up over time as R&D costs come down, and it can actually make their cars more profitable. So Tesla could have done that as well. And this is the thing. So this is strategy, and this is the context that sits around those OKRs, is we need to give clarity around the strategy so then people understand how this current goal or this current objective or this current OKR ladders up to something big, and how it does actually bridge the gap between the work that we're doing today and that final vision. That's the difference between OKRs and strategy. So to make this a little bit clearer, I don't remember where I heard it from, but someone said that your OKRs are a model of your strategy. So this is another really important piece of the puzzle, is strategy comes before your OKRs. You need to make those choices. You need to have that context. You need to have that clarity. What are we doing and why are we doing it? And how do these things build up together and ladder up together, right? And your OKRs kind of become these objectives that are building towards a broader strategy. If we achieve this and we get this kind of outcome, then we know we're heading in the right direction. We know that our strategy is working, or we don't, and then we can pivot and we can make some key choices about how do we change our strategy and how do we adjust. So we can track that, and we know that it's laddering up to something bigger. So to just illustrate this in another way, just to hopefully help with all this, and it's actually kind of funny, I was drawing this in a training course the other day, and they actually asked me, they're like, why is this normally drawn as a pyramid? And I didn't really have an answer back then. And the answer that I have now is that I think it's trying to represent hierarchy. So like the things towards the top of the pyramid, like think about like Maslow hierarchies of needs, or like, food pyramids are often drawn this way as well. The things along the top are very like more broader, abstract, higher level. Things down the bottom, more concrete, more low level. So I think it's just trying to represent hierarchy. Doesn't need to be a pyramid. Don't get too obsessed with it. But if you think about the stack, and this often gets referred to as the product strategy stack. If you think about the stack, at the top we have our vision. Then we have strategy. Then we have, I'm going to put OKRs in here. And yes, this is not perfect because I'm going to put roadmap next. And you can have OKRs on your roadmap, and you absolutely should. And then, you've got the work down the bottom, or like your backlog, if you wanted to call it that. So we kind of end up with this hierarchy. And the key part of this is the fact that OKRs sit in the middle, right? It's kind of a translation activity where we take our strategy, we turn it into objectives or levers that we're trying to achieve. Again, those milestones that are driving towards a broader strategy, things that we can measure, that we can understand if our strategy is going in the right direction. But all of the stuff outside of it, this is all context. And this is all important context that needs to be there and needs to be created before we actually create our OKRs, right? Because if we don't do that, we end up with a gap, which ends up with, I'll just illustrate the gap. If we don't do that, we end up with a gap, and we end up in a world where people are confused. They don't understand why we're doing this OKR. And I've seen this before. The problem that this creates is that there is a lack of clarity in the organization. People don't understand why are we driving towards this OKR? And this lack of clarity, especially for high agency people, they'll go and they will challenge the OKR. And we'll spend a lot of time and energy in the organization arguing about why we're doing that OKR. And if you don't have a good answer as to why we did that, we don't have the data, we don't have the strategy, then we do get stuck in this perpetual wheel. And I've seen it in organizations where we're constantly revisiting our OKRs, constantly challenging them. And I've also seen individuals go off trying to fill the void. And they'll go and they'll try to build what they think the strategy should be. And then they'll try and present it back, and they'll say, well, I know that the OKR is this, but here's the reasons why I think the OKR needs to be this. And this is why I believe we should be doing that. And the problem with this is it creates a lot of misalignment. They spend a lot of time and energy doing those things as opposed to actually executing on the work and actually driving the strategy forward. And this is a problem because this is not an effective way to run an organization. So let's talk a bit about some of the fixes around this and how you can resolve it. So the first one is that in a lot of cases, strategy actually exists inside organizations, right? So sometimes it's just a lack of clarity. We're just not communicating that strategy. So when we set these OKRs, and this is a very common thing I see, this is probably the most common pattern I see, is the strategy does exist. It's just that we're not communicating it with the OKRs. We kind of cascade these OKRs down, which is bad. Shouldn't do that. Watch my video on OKRs around why that's not a good thing. But we kind of communicate through OKRs as opposed to communicating the context around the OKRs, right? So the two things need to come together. And this is why OKRs and strategy are different things. Treat them as different things. And you need to communicate both. So I need to communicate the strategy with the OKRs. I can't communicate the OKRs on their own. Once we are clear on the strategy and everyone's aligned on it, then we can refer to the OKRs as our objective and goal that we're heading towards as part of that broader strategy. And that's okay. And then OKRs become a really effective tool because then we don't need to talk about the strategy every time. We just talk about that, near-term objective that we're driving towards. So the first thing we can do is often just ask for clarity, right? So when leaders are talking to you about an objective, a key result, we can ask simple questions like, okay, why did we choose this OKR? Why is this so important? Out of all the OKRs we could be doing, why did you choose this one? What's the data that led you to selecting that OKR? What are those assumptions that have led us to that? Just trying to get that context out of them is often an easy place to start as well. You can use some tools to help you with that. I've worked in organizations where we've built one pages. So like one pages about OKRs where we got them to define, a little bit more context, like the problem it's trying to solve, the data and the insights that they had that led them to that OKR, what their reflections were, and essentially just some extra context around that. So you can use some tools around that to help. The idea behind those tools is not for it to be a checkbox activity. It's really for it to be a bit of a forcing function to help facilitate those conversations and to help, make sure people are communicating the strategy and the extra context, right? Now, there are situations where the strategy doesn't exist, right? So many of you are probably in that situation. That is a much harder situation to be in because you need to kind of create alignment on the strategy first before you can then come back to the OKRs. And that is not an easy thing to do. As someone who's tried to do that and has done that both successfully and struggled to do it inside organizations, it's not an easy thing. Now, if you are going to go down that path, I've got a bunch of videos about how do you go about creating a strategy, some extra videos about how do you form a strategy. I'll throw a link to one of them up here, but I'll throw some links into the description below so you can watch those videos. But as a starting point, a really good place to start is generally to go and do some research around what the strategy might be. Go and do your discovery. As Roger L. Martin talks about a lot, don't focus on what people say. Look at actions. So what are we focused on? I'll give an example, just a very simple example. There was an organization, one of my clients, they had an OKR that was around basically customer experience. They had like a CSAT type, which customer satisfaction score. Companies also like things like NPS and that type of stuff, but they basically had some OKRs around that. Now, what's really interesting about that is because people will talk to the importance of customer experience. But if you actually observe the behaviors and if you actually observe the work that the leaders were pushing and the work that the teams were focused on, yes, some of it was customer experience focused, but a decent number of it was also cost related. And this is the point about strategy and the context around it. I actually challenged some of the leaders and I asked them, what about if the team came up with a whole bunch of really good work that we could do in order to achieve this OKR? But as part of that, we actually increased our cost base. So our cost to serve our customers would go up. Would that be an acceptable thing? And no surprise, the answer was no. So this is the point about this, a whole bunch of explicit stuff in your organization, but there's a whole bunch of implicit stuff as well. And if you observe what people are actually doing, not just what they're saying, well, cost was still a very important piece of the puzzle. Now that can come into the puzzle as a constraint, and that it doesn't need to necessarily be like we're trying to lower costs, but you can't just say, and this is another great example of how OKRs on their own are just not enough. You can't just tell the teams to increase the experience, increase customer satisfaction, that type of stuff, increase retention if it's going to drive up a cost base. And that's something that you don't want as a business either. So you're going to be clear about that as well. So work within these confines, and all of that is part of strategy. And that is all about building this cohesive picture around the choices that we're making. So one of the choices we're making is to not drive cost up. That is a choice. That is part of strategy. It's not part of strategy, right? So context. Another thing you can do if you're trying to really decipher strategy is to take some of those OKRs and to start to decompose them or build a bit of a value driver tree or KPI tree. So I'm a big fan of doing this. I think this really, really helps because the reality of it is that your OKRs, again, are a model of your strategy. They should be a mirror of the choices that you're making in your strategy. So if we were to put them down, we were to take one of those OKRs and then we'll to start to break it out. So we want to go both ways, right? So we want to try and understand inputs and we want to try and understand outputs. And what I mean by that is not necessarily output from a deliverable, but an output metric. So an output outcome, if that makes sense. So what I mean by this is you start to model this out, and this is a really good workshop to do. And I find this to be a very effective workshop, which is we will take the OKR and then we'll basically say, well, if we were to achieve this, what is this driving towards? What are those higher level outcomes that we're expected? Is it if we do this, we're expected? So I'll give a simple example. So companies will say stuff like, well, if customer satisfaction goes up, I'll change this to customer experience. So I'll just do CX. So if customer experience goes up, people will be happier. Okay, if they're happier, then they will stay with us for longer. So then this will be retention. we might have, well, they'll tell their friends. So we're getting referrals. These things will be like customer lifetime value. This might be, more acquisition. Missed a letter there, but you get my point. You start to map this out. Equally, it's also good to do it on the other side of the fence. Like, what are some of the input metrics that are also driving customer experience? What are some of the things? And you can think about some of these things as like the bets that we're trying to make. You don't need to get too caught up about everything down on this page needing to be an actual metric. It could just be like, well, we believe if we do this, like X, we build this feature, it's going to improve customer experience, which is going to increase retention, increase customer lifetime value. So why do I suggest doing this? And why do I do this as a workshop with my clients? Well, what you're actually doing here is you're starting to unearth the underlying assumptions that we have around the OKR, which is strategy. So if strategy is a coherent set of choices, then there are underlying assumptions and beliefs that we have about those choices and how they interplay together. And explaining the context around those assumptions and those underlying beliefs and the hypotheses that we have, that if we do this, it's going to increase, customer loyalty, which will increase referrals, which will increase blah, and make us more competitive, is strategy. And these are all very important contexts for your OKR. So even if we don't get ourselves into a position where we have this really nice, clear strategy, at the very least, we have started to understand the context around our OKR. We understand, why are we doing this OKR and what do we hope that it drives over the long term? So this becomes a good activity to do because it's a smaller step than trying to get the company and get leaders to actually, create an effective strategy. At the very least, we can get down on paper and tease out those assumptions and that context behind those OKRs. So I really enjoy this activity. I think it's a really fun thing to do, but I think it's also a very effective one. I found it really effective to do inside organizations. A lot easier than trying to get them to say, explaining what strategy is and trying to get them actually to build a strategy, particularly if they haven't done it before in the past. So an underlying tone in all of this is just context and clarity. Netflix has a leadership principle, which is context over control. And I really like that principle because one of the things that we need to do as leaders and what is just really important. So this is maybe like getting back to first principles here. So starting to move a little bit away from OKRs and strategy and just towards first principles of being an effective leader and running effective organizations is clarity, right? I think one of the key pillars of leadership and effective organizations is clarity. One of the reasons why I thought I'll do this video today is because I've had several of my one-on-one coaching sessions with product leaders and founders over the last week or so has been focused in this space. One of the founders that I've been working with has had this exact problem. They've had OKRs without the context, without the strategy, and without the clarity. And as a result of all of that, their team were doing things that they just didn't understand why they were doing those things. They're like, why did the team focus on this when I think they need to be focused over here? And because he only gave them an OKR, you could see how the work that they were doing made sense in the context of that OKR. It actually was driving towards that OKR. So they weren't doing anything that they weren't going rogue or anything like that. They were just working within the context that they had. But the founder had more context. They had a strategy that just wasn't clear to the team. And as a result of that, the team were doing what they thought was best in the context of that OKR in order to drive that OKR. But if they had all this extra context, they would hopefully realize that that was not the most important place to be focused in. They had the focus over here. So this is just a really important component of just good and effective leadership and just good organization. So as maybe a parting thing to kind of leave you on would be to reflect on how much clarity is there in your organization. Are you clear about these things? If you were to look at your OKRs, do you have the context that sits behind them? Do you understand the data that led to that OKR being set? Do you understand the assumptions and the hypotheses about how these OKRs fit together and how they interplay with each other? Because without that, you're stuck being that team with multiple OKRs coming from different directions and you don't understand how they all fit together. And maybe they don't all fit together, which is another problem inside an organization, is that there is no cohesion, there is no strategy, right? And if that is a problem, then we need to solve that problem. So in summary, you can think about your OKRs as those goals and objectives because that's what they are. It's a goal setting framework, but there's a whole bunch of context that sits behind those goals, and that context is strategy. Those goals need to be set and based off your strategy. If you don't have a strategy, what are you basing those goals and objectives off? You're just making them up? Because that's actually probably what happens in a lot of organizations, right? On that note, hope this video was useful for you. Hopefully there's some things you can take away from it. Check out the links in the description below about how to go about building a strategy. I'll throw that one up here as well. And then you can go check out that other video about OKRs, which will be down here at the bottom if you want to learn more about OKRs, how to go about implementing it, and to avoid some of those common traps that I see companies make all the time. So that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you at the next one.